Okay.
Good evening, NNJR. I'm Shannon Muller. Thank you for joining us tonight. As always, I hope all our members are healthy and you all get to enjoy some family time over the 4th of July weekend. I want to thank Brandon for agreeing to share the amazing Brumos collection with us tonight. Brandon is the executive director for the collection, and Hannah Volkers will be Brandon's technical support. They're joining us from the new museum in Jacksonville, Florida. The museum opened January of this year, however, has been closed since March due to COVID. Tonight, we're going to get an inside peek inside the new 35,000 square foot interactive Brumos Museum, which is dedicated to technology, innovation, and historical significance behind some of the world's finest automobiles. It also contains almost 40 rare and significant cars. I'm going to, Bill will be the moderator, and before we begin, if anyone misses any part of this presentation, NNJR will make it available on our website, Facebook page, and obviously on our YouTube channel. I'm going to turn it over to Bill. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you, Shannon, and let me add my welcome to everyone on tonight. So just a couple of housekeeping items, and then I'm going to turn it to Brandon. You have on the YouTube channel, you have on the right a chats section. Please type in your questions there. Brandon is going to show us several cars. So what we're going to hope to do is, if you have questions on the first one, that we'll pose those questions while we're there, and then we'll move on to the next car and so on. And but in any case, either now or later or anytime, please put in your questions so that I can pass them along. I can certainly tell you I'm excited about what we're going to see and hear tonight, because the Brumos collection has some of the most notable Porsches in racing history, and I dare say that there is not a single person on this call tonight who not only has heard of Brumos, but is very aware of the history associated with Brumos racing, and the collection, I think, reinforces that. So without any further ado, let me turn it over to Brandon, and he's going to introduce us to the Brumos collection. Take it away, Brandon.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you, Shannon. I really, after Shannon, I think she pretty much said it all, so I guess we could probably wrap it up now. I'm just kidding. No, we're excited to share this with you. As you mentioned, we did open in January, and then we closed down in March. And so just as we were kind of getting our feet under us and getting some traction, we've had to close down. And so part of what we wanted to do was to begin reaching out to people digitally and try to find a way to connect with car enthusiasts. And that's what ultimately we're trying to do. So Shannon was nice enough to ask us to be part of your region Zoom meeting, and we're real happy about it. I personally have been involved with our local Porsche region, the Florida Crown region, for many years. Prior to this role, I was ultimately the last general manager of Brumos Porsche, then the first general manager of Porsche Jacksonville after Brumos Porsche sold. We had a great relationship with our local region, and it's something that's been very important to us. And as a matter of fact, most of our 65 volunteers here are members of our local Porsche Club region. So it's something important to us, and we're proud to support it. So with that, I can give you a little rundown on where we are first, and then maybe I'll tell you a little bit about who we are. And then we had talked to Bill some, and he mentioned it. I think we'll cover about 3 cars specifically today. We will point out some of the other ones that you may see as we kind of move about. As Shannon mentioned, we do have 40 cars roughly on display at any given time. Our collection hovers around 65. We always say we're done buying, and that doesn't seem to pan out, and then stuff sells. So right around 65, we're having a hard time getting away from, but that's where we are. So we rotate cars out of out of the main display area where we are now. We'll do it fairly regularly. And then sometimes they get asked to be used. Right now, our 550 Spider is up in Atlanta at the PEC Porsche Experience Center up there at the headquarters in their historic section. And so we try to keep a relationship with them, and they borrow some of our cars at times. So as stuff like that comes up, it enables us to rotate cars in and out so that our visitors don't miss anything. You can see what we call our front runner section behind me here, which is our Porsche section. We'll walk past our other section in a little bit, which is what we call our forerunner section. Our forerunners are our older open wheel race cars, and then the front runners are all Porsche cars, mostly race cars, with a couple street cars mixed in. We do have our bent window coupe, our 53 bent window coupe, which would be one of our few road cars on the side. And then our 959, which is a V6, which is the last of the prototypes for that car. But other than that, most of the stuff that you'll see is our race cars. We love race cars because to us, that is where the exciting stuff happens. That's where technology is invented. It's tested to the extreme. And that's where you kind of bring out the best of people and machines, and we find it fascinating. So that's kind of where our interest lies, and that's what you'll see mostly around here. So I think with that, Bill, is it good for me to cover a little Brumos history? And
Please, absolutely.
Okay. So as Bill mentioned, we're fortunate to have a name that many people are familiar with and know. To the extent that people know about us, it varies. So if I cover things that you may already know, I apologize, but maybe you'll pick up on a little tidbit or two that you didn't know before. So essentially, we began in 1953, and we began as a company called Brundage Motors. So if you look at the wall here, we have some photos. Hubert Brundage was a businessman in Miami, and he developed a bit of a racing habit. And so he realized that he could race a lot more affordably if he was in the car business. So in addition to his hardware store, he became a Volkswagen importer and dealer in South Florida in 1953, and again as Brundage Motors. And during that time, when they needed to order parts or communicate with others, businesses or to Europe, they used a telex machine. And the shorthand version of Brundage Motors on the telex was Brumos. So it was Brundage Motors. So there was never actually a Mr. Brumos. It was a shortening of the original name. But Hubert realized that it was much more efficient to write Brumos than Brundage Motors on every letter that went out of the building. And ultimately, he wanted to adopt that for his businesses. He became one of the original 6 Porsche importers to the United States, and then a Porsche dealer as of 1959. And that was the first time you saw Brumos Porsche used, was on that dealer agreement in September of 1959. Again, he raced heavily throughout the 50s and early 60s. One of the people in one of those pictures, we're not going to turn around again, but a guy in a white suit, if you go back and rewind, that's actually Roger Penske racing with Hubert Brundage in an RSK. So it's a pretty deep history. Hubert unfortunately died in a motorcycle accident in 1964, and his wife was left with the business. His son Jan had gone off to run Brumos in South Florida, which eventually became Champion. And so his wife decided it was time to sell the dealership, and a local military intelligence officer named Peter Gregg had been pestering her about buying it. Peter had the good fortune of being married to Jennifer Johnson, whose family was Johnson and Johnson, so they had the pockets to be able to afford it. And eventually, Hubert's wife agreed to sell the dealerships to Peter Gregg in 1965. Gregg was also a racer and used the dealerships as a way to feed his own racing habit. And he did so from the time he bought the dealerships all the way through 1980. It was Peter who began really putting Brumos' name on the map internationally. You'll see on a lot of our cars that we use the number 59. 59 has historically been our racing number ever since Peter Gregg purchased the dealerships. I think you see it first in 1967. It was actually the whole number of the USS Forrestal, which was an aircraft carrier that Peter used to fly into during his time with the Navy. And he just liked the way that the number looked on the side of the ship. So that's where we get our number and why it typically has a battleship type font that's a little bit different than some of the other fonts that you see. But Peter liked the number. It appears in our lives in many different odd ways, but it's one of those things that has settled. But and there's been a lot of debate about how we got our number, but it did come from the USS Forrestal. Peter, he was racing kind of professionally in SCCA. He even still did autocross, in which he was doing in 1967 when a guy in a Corvette showed up to participate. It was just a young kid from Jacksonville University, and he ended up beating Peter. And Peter could take that two ways. He could really get mad, but what he chose to do was say, well, if you could beat me, you must be pretty good. And he asked the young guy named Hurley Haywood if he would go racing with him. So, and that created what was essentially the most dominant race car team throughout the 1970s. They were often known as Batman and Robin, but they would kind of bring us our kind of worldwide notoriety and fame on the racing circuit, beginning with a win in Daytona in 1973. It's the bottom left picture there. And a Porsche 911 RS with RSR underpinnings. It was a prototype car. They won 24 Hours of Daytona that year, and then also the 24 Hours of Sebring. And then I think you could probably see the 917-10 behind me with the Brumos stripes on it. Hurley was racing that year as well. He raced a full season in the Can-Am series, and that is really what put him on Porsche's radar to go on to race for many of the factory teams. Speaking of factory racing, many years we were the actual de facto Porsche factory team in the United States. That was the case in 1973, 1975, then again in 1991. So Peter and Hurley raced through the 1970s. Hurley won Daytona in his career 5 times, Le Mans 3 times overall. And they became this big thing, I guess you would put it. Then in 1980, Peter Gregg had an accident on his way to the track at Le Mans. He had an artist named Frank Stella with him in the car, and a horse carriage pulled out in front of him on a road, on a back road, and they ran into a ditch, and Peter suffered double vision, and he was unable to drive anymore. And so that combined with some kind of mental health issues that were pre-existing, Peter actually ended up committing suicide in December of 1980. His wife of 2 weeks, named Deborah, took over the dealerships through the 1980s. A man named Bob Snodgrass was running the dealerships. He joined Peter in 1972 and then would run the dealerships for Deborah through the 1980s until he approached a local businessman named Dan Davis about buying the dealerships from Deborah Gregg in 1991. Dan agreed with 2 caveats that he'd like to buy it. First, he wanted to go back to professional racing. Second, he wanted Peter's 1979 935 to be included, and both of those conditions were satisfied. So Dan and Bob took over kind of the Brumos operation until Bob died in 2007, and then Dan owned the dealerships until they sold in 2016, including the racing team. When the dealership sold, the name was not sold, neither was Brumos Racing, so we still retain all of those things. The late 90s, because we were around cars, Dan and Bob were both car fanatics, and they had the cars that they would pick up every once in a while for their own enjoyment. They decided to build what they called the museum. So we had an original Brumos museum. It was attached to our race shop near our dealerships off Atlantic Boulevard in Jacksonville. It was a private owned, invitation only. I think it was about 15,000 square feet. They built it and they thought, man, how are we ever going to fill this place up? I think it was about, Dan will tell you, about 8 months later, he had to tell Bob, stop buying cars, we're packed to the gills. So they filled it up pretty quickly. The cars have kind of ebbed and flowed over time. At that point, it was basically cars of the decade. So we had, Brumos racing cars we sold, different cars that were kind of highlights of certain points in throughout the decades. And we've kind of refined that down now to to basically a Porsche collection and then an open wheel IndyCar collection. And so that's where we are today. I was fortunate enough to work with Brumos from 2005 until they sold in 2016. I stayed on with the new ownership group until 2018 when Dan approached me about coming to open his car museum with him. So it sounded like a new adventure, and I was ready to spend time with my children, and that's where we ended up. Bill, I don't think I missed anything.
No, Brandon, that's great. That really brings us up to date and helps us understand how, these cars that, only a few people could come see by invitation now are available to anybody that can book a reservation once we get past the COVID restrictions. So with that, I think you should tell us about some of those really spectacular looking cars there alongside.
Sure. I think we decided to kind of focus, we're going to focus on two of our kind of prototype cars first. So we have the first car we're going to look at is a 1968 Porsche 908K. It's a short tail coupe. This car actually won Nürburgring in 1968 with Vic Elford and Joe Siffert. It was a very early car. This is actually chassis number 8. 1968, the 908s weren't very well sorted out. They knew they had something kind of special on their hands, but they hadn't quite gotten there yet. The Nürburgring race that this ran in, the car itself qualified 27th. But Joe Siffert was brave enough to go jump in the car. They did Le Mans starts at the time. Joe was brave enough to jump in the car and take off without buckling his seatbelt. So he left pits in second place. I don't know at what point on that track you can find time to buckle a 5-point harness, but he did. And they ended up winning the race by about 3.5 minutes. It was raining and hailing, and it was quite the mess. The 908s are interesting cars. It was the first time Porsche built a motor that actually met the full displacement allowance by a series. So this is actually a 3-liter V8 motor. Depending pre-Monza, this motor, the horsepower rating was about 330. I think they got up to about 350 with the 3-liter. And those were revised in later iterations. 908s raced for a long time. I believe they won Nürburgring 4 years in a row, 68 to 71. And then again, it won in 1980. So they had a really long lifespan. They only weighed just shy of 1,500 pounds. So, the total Porsche overcoming a lot through weight savings as much as power. This is really Porsche's precursor to the 917. Once we get to the 917K, you'll see a lot of similarities between the two cars. Extremely light cars. When you're looking at them, you can hardly imagine how brave you must have been to drive them. Safety features were minimal. It had to be noisy, it had to be hot. And you're basically reclined facing up. It's almost like you're stargazing when you're sitting in it.
Brandon,
So with
is
that,
there any air ducted to the driver at all?
None that I've found. I mean, you've got these little windows on the side that you can open, but it's not like you'll see in kind of more modern cars where you have the tubing that's feeding air in. There's a couple vent slats up here, up in the front, but I don't know how effective they'd be. I think they're more kind of keeping humidity off the windscreen more than taking care of the driver. I couldn't imagine running one of these at Daytona in the heat. And it might be a good time for a couple questions, Bill.
Yep. Well, so one question is, did Brumos or did someone else restore this car in particular?
This car in particular, so of the 3 that we'll look at today, this one and the 917 were restored prior to us having the cars. To the extent this one was, I don't think it's been heavily restored. Maybe just some paint. The 917K that we'll see has been fairly heavily restored. For the most part, we do a lot of mechanical work here. We'll do some kind of light restoration type work, but you can really get going down a rabbit hole with some of that stuff unless it's, you know, what you do full time. So we prefer to find them restored and ideally not touched.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So people are asking if these cars were stable aerodynamically, because obviously there was a lot of early history where some of these cars weren't. What's the story with this car?
My understanding that these were a more stable car than say the 917 was early on. I think they had to do a little bit of sorting, but even these cars, you know, you can see the front dive planes on the car to give the a little bit more front grip. They really did excel on low downforce courses. You know, I'm not sure. We would have to. That's more of a question for probably maybe Vic, Elford, or Hurley, or
Sure.
even Hurley didn't. But that's not my understanding. The 917, from what I understand, was much more of a beast than these.
Right. Yeah, I think pretty famous for a lot of those crashing out at their first Le Mans. So,
Yeah.
So with the, I think you said 3-liter V8, was this running in the unrestricted class, or was that to a set of rules? Do you know?
That was to a set of rules. It was they allowed up to 3 liters. They were running 2.5-liter motors in the 907s, and then Metzger created they knew they needed more power in the road car, so they figured they could derive a power plant, a 3-liter power plant for this car. Now they did it with 8 cylinders instead of 6, but from what they learned from it, they transferred that to the road cars. So they built it to the series.
Interesting. It's interesting that it has 2 seats. What's that about?
Yeah, so that's part of the homologation rules, and then it's something that will carry through a lot of these early prototype cars. The 917 even has a spare tire. This one's got what you'd call a luggage compartment in the spare seat. Somehow that's how they qualified them as production cars, passenger cars, but it's more just
the good old days of the Le Mans and the FIA rules, I guess, right?
Yeah, it's just a way to make it more expensive. It's silly looking back, but back then they set a set of rules, and this was Porsche being clever to work within those rules. I think once you got down to only having to produce 25 of the things, they could get a little creative and add a second seat and mirrors in a luggage compartment and say it's a road car.
Yeah, got it. So I know somebody's asking how much it weighed. I know you said, but I think you said just under
1,500 pounds dry.
Yeah, thinking
like
by
nothing.
today's standards, that's absolutely crazy, right?
Yeah, the motor's going to weigh most of that. When we get to the end of the building, we can show you. We have a spare frame from our 917 on the wall, but if you see just how minimal the materials are, it's pretty amazing.
So how much? Do you know offhand what the wheelbase is?
I don't. Let me check my little kiosk here. We don't have our wheelbase listed. Yes, I do. 91 inches, 92 inches, 91.7. So.
Yeah. So this is really, it's obviously not a very big car, but it's even maybe smaller than it appears. So.
Yeah, they're a little bit deceptive. They look much bigger than they really are. A lot of our older Indy cars over there actually have a longer wheelbase than this car.
Right. Now that's fantastic. Well, maybe that's a good point to bridge us on to the 917 that we saw for a second when you walked over to the kiosk.
Sure. As I move, Hannah's just going to kind of give everybody a glimpse of some of the other cars while we try to move some lights over so you can see easier. And it's better to look at cars than me moving lights.
Well, it's interesting. There was some conversation on the NNJR website, or Facebook page rather, today about 914. So it was interesting to see the 914 sitting there. that, I know some people on this
Yeah, that
call
was one of our
could
early
explain the
IMSA
history of it.
champion cars.
Yep. Um,
And if there's camera angles that people are requesting, let me know. I'm trying to set it up as best as possible.
No worries.
Okay, there we go. All right.
Great.
So it's kind of ironic that the first two cars that we picked today are not cars that we've raced. They were actually raced by other people. Joe Siffert raced the 908, as I mentioned, and then we get to what is our 1970 917K, probably one of the most kind of famous Porsches of all time. I don't know, as far as the livery goes and the body style goes, and what they meant to the success of Porsche. I mean, it's quite shocking. This car itself was Joe Siffert's personal car. It was a test car for Porsche that they were running different setups prior to Le Mans. And then they allowed Joe to buy the car from them after testing. Then Steve McQueen actually leased this as one of the cars for the movie Le Mans. It was used. This one was particularly used as a camera car. It was number 22 in the movie. But as Hannah makes it around, I'll point out our camera mounts from when the car had the camera set up on it. I'll show you the mounts here, and then we can show you on the kiosk where they were. It's been interesting since we've opened. We had this car for a couple years before anyone knew we had the car. And we thought it might be fun when we opened the doors to the public to have a bit of a surprise. And so we did that. And I guess we were a little naive on what a splash this one would have. So part of the kind of misnomer is that everyone made a big deal about this being from the movie Le Mans, and I guess it was, but it's more special to us. I think because of its history of ownership going through Joe Siffert, and then later his estate had the car for quite a while. You can see the camera mounts here when they used it on the street. But this car,
that's absolutely crazy when we look at it, right? By today's standards,
isn't it? So what's amazing too, so if you go from the 908, which I said made close to 350 horsepower, and then you get into this car, which has closer to 650 horsepower, they weigh relatively the same. Let me just double check. This is 1,700 pounds, 1,750 pounds, which is still nothing. It is absolutely unbelievable what they would do. You got 12 cylinders here, 5 liters. So basically 2.5 liter 6-cylinder motors joined together. This is naturally aspirated. Our 91710 is turbocharged. But even still, there's stories of these cars going 230 miles an hour plus down the Mulsanne.
Well, and one of the comments we just got in, Brandon, was about how Vic Elford and other drivers said these cars were basically undrivable, right? Nobody wanted to get in them.
And believe it or not, they gnats, the bugs, helped solve that problem. They were running tests. I think Brian Redmond was driving, and they were going out and testing, and the car was just undrivable. And they brought it in, and luckily an engineer noticed that the front end was all covered with these little gnats, but there were no gnats on the back of the car. So they made these little metal wedges that they attached to the rear body panel, and sent them out again, and it just totally changed the handling of the car. And the gnats saved the day. So no, it was actually, I'll point out the shape here. This isn't the model, but you can kind of see where the car comes up here.
Mm-hmm.
In earlier cars, they were you can see how the angle comes up a little bit above the windscreen. In the earlier cars from like 68, the aero was too low. And so the wind wasn't hitting the rear of the car. So they had to figure out. and they were doing all their wind tunnel testing. It was almost like being on a trapeze. And so they couldn't figure out really what was happening because they were trying to find downforce by having it suspended on this scale, basically. But it was throwing it off because it wasn't getting the ground effect that it needed to give them an actual reading.
Yep. Yeah.
But one of the other bits of feedback we get is that people wonder why number 70 is on our car. 1970 was actually the year Joe Siffert married his wife Simone, and he died in a crash at Brands Hatch in 1971. And the car actually led Joe's funeral procession. 50,000 people showed up for that. But Simone kept the car in case their son ever wanted to use it. And we thought because it was a test car and because it meant so much to the family that we wanted to put a number that was of significance to them. And so that's where that came from.
Brendan, I had heard or read that the car sat literally for 20 years or more just in the garage. I guess you just explained, the reason for that. Can you tell us any more about that part of the history?
I know just a little bit about that part of the history. The car sat, it was in Europe. The nice part was, with it being a test car and not actually raced, and with it sitting so long, it may be one of the more original examples of any of them out there, just because there were no, major racing incidents or parts salvaging or whatever. But when they found it, the frame itself was in pretty rough shape. And so I wonder if we can get over here. I'll point out, when it was originally restored, it was put on a extra prototype frame that they had at Visan, which we have on the wall. So we're just gonna, can you see that there?
Not.
This is the challenge of moving through a space digitally, but it's kind of an interesting part of the story.
Yeah, you're doing fine. Oh, there we go.
So that is the frame of a 917K. But that was the spare frame that they restored the car on originally. Like I said, it was an actual 917K frame, but it was a prototype frame that they had at Visan. They went to sell the car. There were no takers. Bill Warner from Amelia Island Concourse says it perfectly. He said, there were 25 917s built originally, and tragically only 38 exist today. There's a little bit of that fear. So what they did is once they realized that nobody was interested in buying the car on a frame that it didn't come with, they actually repaired the original and then just salvaged the prototype frame. But it's interesting to see, and it's also interesting to hopefully it translates on video, but that is a very, I don't know, precarious thing to trust your life at 230 miles an hour.
That's a great picture and a great story to look at, because there's nothing to that. It probably weighs what, 50 pounds, 100 pounds?
Two of us can lift it. Yeah.
Wow.
Really nothing. OSHA would not be pleased with how we got it up there, but it didn't take more than, just a couple tie down straps and a pulley.
Yep. No, you can tell. Wow. Pre Monacock, as someone in our questions and comments said. So one of the questions not related to the frame is, somebody said, if it's right-hand drive, why is this key still on the left? Somebody's more observant than I am looking at the pictures.
Well, the portion, because the shift knob is on the right. So the thought is, I guess you're only reaching over once, but then the thought is you could be shifting while you're starting the car. And that's the thought. So all Porsche keys are always on the left, and this is no exception, but it's just kind of way over there.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, that's.
If anybody's looking for anything interesting to watch, you could just sit and watch Le Mans starts all day on YouTube, and they're fascinating and kind of terrifying. It's amazing that they did them as long as they did. But again, this car, go ahead.
Speaking of starting, one of the questions is how often do these cars like this one get started or driven?
So we are working through that now. We've been cramped for space for a while. But if anyone follows us on social media, we just showed a video of our Lee Keen Safari car. Was our first car to run on our new 4-wheel dyno. So they will get run on the dyno at least once a year. And if not more frequently, but that is the drop dead bare minimum. And then, you know, events like Rinsport and what have you, we'll take them to. This car has been hidden away for a while, so we don't have like a normal for it yet, but the goal is that they all get out and run and that people get to see them. 917s are a bit of an interesting beast to start. It's quite a process to get them going.
Hannah, while you're there, we have a request for a view out the windscreen from the driver's perspective. Can we do that? Wow, that's awesome. Very.
Again, it doesn't do it justice. It's hard to explain how reclined you are in that seat when you're in it. And it's what those guys did was just, you know, one of the constant themes here is just the absolute dedication to the idea of going fast, because it would just be miserable.
Does a driver literally have to hold their head up, Brandon? It looks like it.
It basically rests against the back wall.
I see. Oh, okay.
So it's basically down between your belts.
Wow. Wow.
And I know they're much more proficient at heel toe shifting than I am, but I just don't see how the layout, it would just seem real easy to get tangled up on your own feet.
Yeah, not much room down there.
You had to be tiny. You had to be tiny to drive them. And remember that the fuel tanks are, you know, beside you. And
yeah, somebody made a comment that they thought Pedro Rodriguez was supposedly the master of driving the 917s. I don't recall that personally, but I see that in the comments.
I guess there were a few of them. They're all pretty competitive, so I think any of them would say that about themselves, probably.
Yeah, I suppose, right.
Vic Elford may say the same thing.
Yeah, well, we've heard Vic speak, and yes, I would think he would say the same.
That's one of the great things about race car drivers is the level of competitiveness is as high as in any sport. So one thing that always does amuse me, you know, you do see again, another homologation rule, but the collapsible spare in the rear of the car. And every time I see it, I just think, you know, frustrating Porsche owners since 1970.
Yeah, that just looks so out of place. But for those who didn't hear it earlier, yeah, that was required by the homologation rules, and they had to build 25 cars, and they had to have 2 seats, and they had to have a spare tire, and who knows what else.
Because at that point, it's a production road car. It's just luckily they made it the production number so low that it was achievable. You know, there's stories of the first batch of 917s. You know, the secretaries were laying fiberglass to get the cars produced before the FIA inspectors came. They had just weeks to build the cars, 25 of them, to make it into make it into Le Mans. So it was like a total effort.
And actually, what I remember reading about that, yeah, I remember reading that, and also, allegedly, who knows, that some of the motors in the cars were not real, at least weren't weren't the track motors. They were something else.
One of the stories I heard from someone I won't name was that they showed them about 15 of the cars and decided, whoa, look what time it is, it's lunchtime. And then they took them all to lunch and showed them the others. So, which involved just moving the cars around. So I think you were right.
Okay.
There wasn't enough time to do that.
Yep.
So
Well,
with that, we could probably move to a 935. Would that be?
yeah, let's do that.
I don't want to call an audible. I will just say it's just a little. I cannot get to the motor in that car. So would you be okay with a Daytona winner, a 77 Daytona winner?
Sure.
RSR. Okay. And then we could talk about the 935. I just without being able to get to the motor and whatnot, it's a little tricky. I'll point it out. The car I had originally planned on showing. It's a 1979 Porsche 935. It's one of the very few kind of unmolested 935s. This is how it ran at the end of the season. This was Peter Gregg's car. It was an IMSA championship winning car. Peter loved his tartan plaid seats, and so that was Peter's seat. One interesting thing about Peter is his nickname was Peter Perfect. And one of the things you'll see on the back of our race cars many times is a little sticker that says "Made in Jacksonville." And that comes for a couple reasons, but first and foremost, what we would do when we get a race car is basically take it completely apart and reassemble it ourselves, what we would call the right way. But Peter was known for doing that, and the Made in Jacksonville was kind of a thumb in the nose of Porsche. But he would do things like install heavier duty shifters, like you'll see in the car. They were a little bit more stable. We would go through and check every nut bolt part. And then we also track prepped a lot of 914s and 911s that ended up racing in Mexico and South America. But if you ever see Made in Jacksonville on the back of a car, it's because of the amount of rebuilding that takes place once the shell of the car arrives. And then with that, I'll show you the 935 here, and then maybe we'll go back to the workshop and do some question and answer and go from there. So this car actually won the 1977 24 Hours of Daytona. It's a 1975 Porsche 911 RSR. It's a naturally aspirated car. This was the last naturally aspirated Porsche to win overall at Daytona for years and years and years. I think until 2000, maybe 99. Don't quote me, but that gets you kind of in the ballpark of when it happened again. This same year, they started running turbochargers on Porsches, running 930, what would have been like the 934. But Hurley Haywood did not feel confident putting a new technology on a car for a 24-hour race. So they took this naturally aspirated, old car. It qualified dead last. And it was actually Team Slow Snail. But ultimately, all the turbochargers started overheating during the race. As a side note, after they qualified, Hurley's co-drivers came to him and said, "Oh, by the way, we don't want to drive at night." So Hurley ended up driving an 8-hour stint at night during the longer kind of pit stops, driver change pit stops. He would go back in behind a tent and put on the other driver's helmet and pretend he was fooling someone and go back in the car and continue on. But they ended up winning the 24 Hours of Daytona overall in this car by a decent margin. But this is one of my favorite cars. It sounds a little bit like the Tasmanian Devil when it's running. It's just kind of pure Porsche.
So this is one of those cars that stayed with Brumos the whole time, I presume.
No, the only one that, yes and no. Yes and no. Most of them stayed around. This belonged to a local racer. And we ended up, acquiring it from them. But for the most part, they kind of stick around. And cars have a way of being offered back to you over time. People knew where they came from, and they know you may have an interest more so than most. Brumos cars are a little bit like 917s in that it seems like they keep reproducing. There's more today than there were ever. Yes.
Somebody wants to know how much that car weighs, that 75.
Let me check the spec sheet. It is very, very little. It's 1,984 pounds.
Wow.
But this one, unlike the others, it's metal. Whereas every car we've looked to this point has been fiberglass.
Yep. So one of the questions we're getting is said that looks like it's an MFI ignition as opposed or MFI versus the CIS used in the road cars.
I believe so. Let me double check. You have to forgive me. I get a little rusty. Mechanical fuel injection, yes.
Yeah. Okay.
High butterfly.
Okay. So actually, one of the questions that I was curious about, you have all that wonderful information on those kiosks. I understand from something you said and something I read. Oh, there's Made in Jacksonville. I love it. That you and the museum spent a lot of time and energy getting those write-ups done by some pretty well-known people. Can you tell us about the kiosk content?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is something we worked with our museum collateral company to create. And then we had Jean Lindemood Jennings. She was the editor of Automobile Magazine for years and years and years. She has Jean Knows Cars now. And a lady named Mary Seelhorst helped write the content for the kiosk. But each car has at least it has the most important thing about it, or why we have it, basically. It has at least 3 separate stories about each car. Then they each have their own photo gallery and their own spec sheet. So the goal was, one, to kind of engage younger visitors and have them interact with the cars in the way that they're in a lot of ways, used to interacting with the world, which is through a touchscreen and at their own pace. And 2, it's a way, the interesting thing about cars is different people like cars for different reasons. So some people may like kind of the emotional connection to them or the people stories behind the cars, but another person might just be fascinated with the technical side of the car. And this allows visitors to find what it is that interests them about cars and to explore at their own pace. And it's been it was a bit of a kind of roll of the dice to see how people would like them, but we've had a lot of positive feedback. Now it's a little bit ironic that we came out with touchscreen technology just as a highly contagious virus hits the scene. So we actually have some new styluses or styli that are on their way here so that people can use a stylus rather than their finger on the touchscreen. But it's been really nice, and people like to have options and to guide themselves, and the hope is not let it be boring. And like I mentioned, we have a lot more cars than we have on the floor at any given time. So if I were to trade out a car, I can just call up the information about each car and swap it out really quickly. So it saves a lot of storage room for signage and whatnot.
That's great. So we have a request for more a picture of the transporter behind you there and the story with that guy.
Sure, we'll step back a little bit. This is what we call Buster, but it's a 1968 Mercedes transporter that was the Porsche factory team transporter, and it was one of two. And these cars worked for the Porsche factory from 1968 to 1988. And they would have hauled some of the most famous cars that Porsche made. I'll show you a picture on the kiosk here in a second. But the reason we have our 910 staged the way we do is that we actually have a picture of the car being loaded in 1967 on the Buster.
That's great.
So, and then on the side of the door, we have our suits hanging. We've tried to get different signatures of different people over the years that have worked through the bus. You got Alvin Springer, Hurley Haywood, who's on there. Manfred Janke is on there. Brian Redman. So a lot of it was around during kind of the heyday of racing, and it's one of our kind of prized possessions. Interestingly enough, the museum itself, our floors are raised. They're data floors, and they're raised by 3 inches. That way we can run the wires to all of our kiosks and not have kind of tripping hazards. But the one vehicle that could not roll on those floors is Buster the Bus here. So we actually brought the bus in, put it up on jack stands, and built the floors around it. So it is the one vehicle that cannot leave the museum unless it's a absolute emergency. And the irony is it probably runs better than any car in here. So. Let me open the door.
Yeah, it looks like a bus, like you said.
The picnic baskets are my favorite.
Oh, look at that.
So this bus would have run with I think it had 3 liveries. It ran the Porsche factory livery like is on it now. I would have had Rothman's livery and a Martini livery. The other one was the factory livery. I believe it was a Gulf livery and a Martini livery. So
Right.
that other one's over in Europe now.
Great. So I
Should
think
we walk to the workshop
walk
and we
over
can do
to-
question and answers? Okay.
Yeah, let's walk over to the shop, and while we're doing that, somebody was asking why it was a Mercedes. I could guess the answer, but I'll let you answer it.
I think it was just, I don't think Porsche made a solution for that. So as far as I know, that they just needed a transporter. I don't think Porsche built anything for that. And
Yeah.
Mercedes was right down the
And
road.
it's another German company right down the road.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. So while you're walking over there, tell us a little bit about the other half of the museum.
Yeah, so we're coming up on the other half of the museum, kind of reverse chronologically. So these are believe it or not, the newer cars on the 4Runner side. The car that's on the screen now is a 1963 Watson Roadster Indy car. It's an Offenhauser powered car. A lot of the focus of the 4Runner side is it begins in 1914. We have one of the first cars with dual overhead camshafts, which was the precursor to all modern high performance vehicles. It's the great grandfather of one of 2 cars to showcase that first technology. But that story kind of leads its way through kind of American and European motorsports, I guess. But it started with Peugeot, came to the US to a guy named Harry Miller. Harry Miller was a genius, a bad businessman, but a genius. And a guy named Fred Offenhauser was his shop foreman. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of Offie Motors running at Indianapolis, but basically the technology in those Offie motors began with Harry Miller. We probably have one of the most extensive Miller collections in the world. Very hard to find a genuine Miller car because most of the time when their IndyCar racing life was over, the parts would be robbed for for whatever kind of fun racing someone wanted to do and make, everybody robbed motors and parts and cars to go race for as long as they could. And so to find a complete Miller car is very rare. The green one that was on the diorama that you saw earlier, that was one of 7 cars built for the 1923 season. That car has actually won Pebble Beach overall, and the Amelia Island Concourse is overall best of show sport. So kind of fascinating cars, and believe it or not, I have a kind of intensive Porsche background. I find myself falling more and more in love with these cars the more time that I'm here.
Now, are these here because of Mr. Davis's interest, or how did that?
Yes, it's
come
a passion for him. He still remembers the first time he saw a Miller car in one of his car magazines when he was a kid, and he fell in love with it. And then when we go pass by that green Miller, the 1923 was kind of, I don't know, the gateway drug to all of this. But he started learning kind of the interconnection of people and stories. And I think it fascinates him, the amount of inventiveness that it took to create these cars. He'll tell you the technology when these cars were made didn't exist. They had to invent it. And it's really kind of interesting to see the things that they tried, things that worked, things that didn't work. The Golden Submarine there was the first Miller car. And he thought his friend Bob Berman died in an accident, so he wanted to create a closed cockpit car to try to make it safer. Well, all it did was freak the drivers out, totally scared them. And the car, this is one of the few recreations we have. The original ceases to exist, but the car itself made it 3 or 4 races before they lopped the top off because it was heavy and it just scared the driver so much. At the time, you wanted to be ejected from the vehicle. That was the safest escape route if you hit something. But they would do interesting things. So this is actually a supercharged car. So you can see the supercharger in the back. It's an inline 8-cylinder motor. These cars could run, 140 miles an hour, which would be absolutely terrifying. But the superchargers would spin 38,000 RPMs. And then if you think, okay, they didn't have anything to, they didn't have any kind of electronic balancing or computerized balancing, technology, that everything was by hand. There's stories that they would balance the blades of the superchargers on the tips of razor blades to check for balance. So it was just really amazing.
Wow.
And I don't know about you, but I don't know, we'll go to Indy and do kind of demo days or Miller's Milwaukee event every couple times a year. We'll go to an event, and just running kind of pace laps is one thing in those tires, but I don't know how they could trust those tires at speed around any kind of oval.
140 miles an hour on those tires on banking.
Yeah.
No thanks.
No, thank you. And so then we also tell a lot of the story. Board track racing was a big deal in the U.S. in the teens and 20s. You can see the diorama with our 1923 Miller. But that gives people a sense of what a board track would have looked like. There were I'm blanking on names, Prince, and I can't remember the other gentleman's name, but their business was they would build railroad spurs into town, and about 3,000 men would ride the railroad into town, and they would build these board tracks. Some of them were as large as 2 miles long. Some of them were half a mile. But they could build like the half-mile circuits in 3 weeks. They would use about 50 tons of nails.
Wow. Crazy.
So we'll move to the workshop.
Great.
It's a little bit of an eclectic workshop at the moment. We have our 1923 Locomobile to my right. We have some Porsches, 1931 Samson Special, S500 Mercedes-Benz. So this is where all of our cars run except for two. Hannah, can you show them which two do not run? The two on the roof.
Ah, the ones that are upside down.
That's correct. Everything else runs and is maintained here in the shop. And like I said, we don't get too extensive into restorations. I say that, but here's what one would look like. This is our 1926 Bugatti Type 35. Talk about simplicity. That's it down to its frame. And we're in the middle of a pretty heavy restoration project on that car. And then you get stuck in the place of, you know, how far do you go with these things? You want to keep them as original as possible. Our philosophy on restoring cars has changed quite a bit, even over the last couple of years, in that, you know, I think we'd rather see a car like our Locomobile over here that is that shows signs of age and originality and kind of marks of history, as opposed to something that's totally overly restored. You know, the 917K, for example, is just so restored. I don't know that it looked that nice to begin with. Whereas when you see a car like the Locomobile, where you can see the horsehair poking through and kind of the signs of age, you know, that's kind of become beautiful to us.
Yeah. So if somebody wants to know if that's a Lee Keen off-road rally car.
It is. That is our Lee Keen Safari car. So Lee was actually on our GT championship team. I don't know if you can get his picture. He drove for us from 2011 until 2013. And we won a championship in our 2011 Cup car. And when he started doing these, we kind of felt like we needed to have one. So he helped us design it. And we actually have a really cool video on YouTube. If you Google the Brumos Collection Safari car, Lee comes out and puts all kinds of scratches all over it and gets it dirty. So it's kind of it was a fun video we were able to do. But
That's great. So somebody wonders if that's a Porsche Indy car up on the ceiling.
no, one's a Jaguar Formula One car, and then the WorldCom car is a excuse me, where is it? It's a kart series car.
Got it. Okay, great.
Cosworth, yeah.
Okay. And what are we looking at here? The silver car?
The silver car is Mercedes-Benz 300S.
Oh, that's the
So-
300S. Okay, from the other angle. Got it.
Yeah, so we're going through this car now. It's got some electrical work that needs to be done. This is one, again, where we're happy to have our space and be up and running again. So we're trying to sort through some of these cars and get them out on the road. And that's the plan with this one.
So do you do, I mean, you said you don't really do lots of full bore restoration. Somebody's asking about the connection with Brumos and the Bugatti that you obviously are doing lots of work on.
Yeah, well, we are and we aren't. So we could, you know, with that car, in a lot of ways, we've taken it apart and then we've farmed the pieces out to experts that in a particular field. So if you're, you know, we may send the motor to one place and then the body to another place for paint and the interior somewhere else. So whereas, you know, I think a restoration, most of that stuff would be done in-house.
Right.
Now, we do make things and make parts, but we're not a full-on restoration shop. We're fully equipped to get there. It's just not where we've been to this point. You know, our workshop until, you know, 2013, and then we sold the dealerships, was basically our race shop. So it was more set up for prepping race cars than it was restoring old cars.
Makes sense. So how many techs work in your shop?
We have 2 full-time right now and then a part-time. We may get up to 3 at some point. We're just going to see how we're still learning the flow of getting cars in and out of here. But for example, the Samson is ready to go back in. the building. But this is an example of something we would do. I don't know if you can get this one. We had to redo the gearbox on, and then while we were at it, we rebuilt a clutch pedal because the other one was built for teeny tiny little people, and none of us could operate it correctly. So, you know, we built that clutch out of blanks here.
Okay.
That kind of work, you know, we do more of.
Yeah.
Sealing, wiring, more mechanical type stuff than working with, like, you know, hides and whatnot. I can show you the engine room real quick while we're here, and I can answer questions as we move.
Yeah, while you're walking over there, I had seen an article that Mr. Davis had been generous with McPherson College, and you know, who trains, you know, young people in car restoration and old car technology in general. And I just thought that was fantastic connection between his support for you know, not only the museum but for the industry.
Yeah, and I'm going to step out here while she walks around it, so I don't echo. Yeah, that's actually one of the things that we strongly believe in. Is Dan especially strongly believes in places like McPherson. He's stepped up in a big way to help that school. And if people aren't aware, they do an amazing job of blending kind of tradecraft as well as college education. So one of our technicians that works here is a graduate. He graduated with a college degree in collections management. And so along with learning how to restore cars and care for cars and work on cars, he also learned about kind of managing a collection and what that takes. And it's great. You know, we've learned that, you know, more and more, you know, as I said, we farm a lot of our skilled labor out for some of this stuff, and those people are becoming rarer and rarer. Especially, you know, you look at our Miller cars and our really old cars, there's so few people that are qualified to work on those things, that have been kind of trained appropriately and that are patient enough to do it. So we want to support in any way we can, kind of keeping that alive.
Yeah, that's great. So related to that, you know, on the Porsche side, how much support in terms of parts or information or whatever do you get from Porsche, the factory, Porsche, the company?
I would say we still have a very good relationship. I don't know that we necessarily need a lot of parts support, but lately the way they've been very helpful is through archive support. You know, they're currently Sean Cridlin's working on a Brumos book. I know they've been helpful with him. For our kiosks, there were some photos and things that we needed that the archives were very helpful with. But for the most part, that's where the help is. Still have a good relationship with Ray Schaefer, who's in Atlanta with Porsche, and he's working with kind of getting their Porsche classics off the ground and on the retail level. We're interested to see where that goes. I think it's a brilliant idea.
Okay.
Relationships are still there. We haven't really depended on them too much to this point.
Great. Okay, and probably maybe not the last question while we're looking at more of the cars. Tell me, you know, just take a minute and tell us about this beautiful building you're in that I understand Dan Davis, you know, said he wanted it to look like a former Jacksonville Ford factory.
Yeah, so kind of long way that we got there is once the dealerships were selling, we knew we needed to find a place to put the cars. And at the time, it was going to, you know, still be a kind of a private collection. And he went about looking at pre-existing facilities. And one of the places he just really loved and had always loved was this. We have a Ford assembly plant downtown in Jacksonville, and it has a huge brick facade with these big windows and skylights, and Dan just loved it. But it's so far gone now that there was no way to kind of refurbish it to a point where you'd feel comfortable keeping cars like this in it. So that was kind of the design instructions for the architect. So that's where we get our huge windows and, like I said, our big skylights. The nice part about the windows is that they are all electro chromatic glass. So they are set to a sensor and will tint throughout the day, depending on where the sun is, to keep the light consistent in here and to kind of protect the cars from the sunlight. I'll turn on the light in the lobby here.
Okay.
I think there's something like 1 million bricks in the building here.
Wow.
Let's see. And so in our foyer, most people would be surprised to see a Ford Model T, but that's the first thing you see when you walk in, and it's actually the car was assembled at the Jacksonville plant in 1926 and has spent its whole life here. And so we thought that was a kind of an appropriate introduction to the facility. So we have that in our lobby, and then there's a picture of what the local plant looked like.
Oh, that's just fantastic. That's really great. So perhaps a good place to to wrap up. Any last minute comments you'd like to make before we put a bow on it?
No, I just wanted to say thank you for having me, and I do appreciate any feedback that you guys can provide. This is one of those things that a couple months ago we didn't know we would be getting into, but I think it's a good solution for our kind of new normal, and we'd like to make it as entertaining as possible. So any feedback is welcomed, and we appreciate everybody taking the time to do it.
Great.
We hope you come see us when this is all clear.
Well, that's what many of us are hoping to be able to do, and we really do appreciate you and Hannah taking the time. This is fantastic. We really got a great tour of what's an unbelievably impressive collection that you have there. So thank you very much.
It's been an honor. Thank you.
I'm going to turn it
Good
back
night.
I'm going to turn it back to Shannon. Thanks again, Brandon.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brandon and Hannah. That was awesome. I loved every minute of it. I learned a lot, and I can't wait to try to see that in person. Wanted to say great call. We've had a little over 85 people on at one point. So those folks that are on our YouTube right now, please, why don't you subscribe to our channel? And in closing, please join us next Tuesday, July 7th, for another webinar with author Peter Stout, who is the editor of 000 magazine, and that will be at 7:30. Thanks again, Brandon and Hannah. Thank you, Bill. It was a great night. Take care.